The copper still gleamed like a forbidden promise in the corner of the cabin, its coils catching the dying light of October as Willa Jameson measured out the last of her father's cornmeal with trembling hands. She had buried him 3 weeks ago, just as the aspens on the mountainside began their golden transformation, and the reality of her situation had settled over her like the first frost. 22 years old, alone on a homestead 40 miles outside of Boise, Idaho, with winter approaching like a stalking wolf and exactly $17 to her name. Her father had been teaching her the family trade, the secret recipe passed down through generations of Jamesons who had turned grain into liquid gold. But he had died before the autumn harvest could be sold, before she could learn all the nuances of timing and temperature that separated rot gut from something worth drinking. The cabin felt enormous without his presence, every creak of the floorboards echoing her solitude. Willa had considered returning east to Baltimore, to the cousins who had written once after her mother's death 5 years ago with vague offers of charity. But the thought of abandoning the land her father had died proving up, of walking away from the only home she had known since childhood, felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked for. So she had made her decision, standing over his grave with dirt still under her fingernails. She would do what Jamesons had always done when times grew desperate. She would brew. The copper still had belonged to her grandfather, smuggled west in pieces and reassembled in the root cellar beneath the cabin. Her father had moved it upstairs after her mother died, no longer bothering to hide what the whole county already suspected. Willa had watched him work it hundreds of times, had helped him measure and mix and tend the fire, but doing it alone felt different, dangerous. Not just because making spirits without a license could land her in territorial prison, but because she genuinely was not sure she could produce anything drinkable. She started the mash that evening, mixing the cornmeal with spring water and the last precious cups of malted barley, adding her father's special blend of yeast that he had cultivated for years. The mixture had to ferment for days, and during that time, Willa threw herself into preparing the homestead for winter. She chinked every gap in the cabin walls with mud and moss, chopped wood until her shoulders screamed, and hauled stones to reinforce the foundation where frost heave had caused cracks. At night, she collapsed into her father's bed, too exhausted even for grief, though it waited for her in the moments before sleep. The first batch came off the still on a gray November morning when ice rimmed the water bucket. Willa's hands shook as she caught the clear liquid in mason jars, watching the proof bead form and break. Too fast meant it was weak. Too slow meant it would strip paint. She had aimed for somewhere in the middle, but she would not know if she had succeeded until someone braved a taste. She sealed the jars and set them aside, then immediately started another batch. If she was going to survive the winter, she needed inventory. By the time the first snow fell, she had 43 jars of moonshine lined up in the root cellar. Some were better than others. A few, she suspected, were actually quite good. The question was how to sell them. Her father had never lacked for customers, men who would ride out from Boise or one of the mining camps to the north, but they had come for him, trusted his reputation. Willa was an unknown quantity, and a woman besides. She could not exactly set up a stall at the general store. She decided to take a calculated risk. She loaded 6 jars into saddlebags, chose the 3 she thought were best, and rode into Boise on a crystalline December morning when the air hurt to breathe. The town was small but growing, caught in that awkward transition between frontier outpost and something resembling civilization. False-fronted buildings lined the main street, and the sound of hammers rang from 3 different construction sites despite the cold. Willa tied her horse outside the Silver Spur saloon and carried her jars inside, ignoring the stares that followed her. Women did not frequent saloons, not respectable women anyway, but Willa had stopped worrying about respectability the moment she fired up an illegal still. The bartender, a thick-necked man with impressive mutton chops, looked her up and down with unconcealed skepticism. "We do not serve ladies," he said, though his tone suggested she might not qualify for the term. "I am not looking for a drink," Willa said, setting a jar on the scarred wood of the bar. "I am looking to sell. My father was Thomas Jameson. Maybe you heard of him." Recognition flickered in the bartender's eyes. "Old Tom, heard he passed. That is recipe. It is mine now." The bartender picked up the jar, held it to the light, swirled it experimentally. "Looks clean, but looking and drinking are different things." He uncorked it and took a cautious sip, then a longer pull. His eyebrows rose. "Well, damn, girl, you got your daddy's touch, maybe better. This is smooth." Relief flooded through her. "I have 40 jars. I will have more by January. $2 a jar, and I will deliver within 10 miles of town." $2. That is robbery. That is the price for quality. You want rot gut, buy from the miners. You want something your customers will not go blind drinking, you buy from me. They haggled for another 5 minutes before settling on $1.75, and the bartender agreed to take 20 jars immediately. Willa left with $35 in her pocket, enough to buy supplies for another month and still have money left over. She stopped at the general store for cornmeal, salt, coffee, and dried beans, then headed for the feed store to buy oats for her horse. She was loading bags onto her horse when she heard the fight. 2 men had squared off in the street, circling each other while a crowd gathered. One was a miner, judging by his clothes, his face already bleeding from a split lip. The other was a cowboy, tall and lean, wearing a battered hat and a canvas coat that had seen better years. They were arguing about cards, about someone cheating, and the miner had a knife. Willa should have ridden away, should have minded her own business and been grateful it was not her fight. But the cowboy had his hand hovering near his gun, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was calculating whether he could draw before the knife struck. She had seen that same calculation in her father's eyes once, years ago, when a customer had objected to his prices. That time had ended with blood in the dirt and her father loading the wagon in the middle of the night. "Hey!" Willa shouted, surprising herself. Both men turned to look at her. "You." She pointed at the cowboy. "You are Iris York. You used to work for the Parker Ranch." It was a complete lie. She had no idea who he was. But she said it with enough conviction that he blinked, confused, and the moment of distraction was enough for a deputy to wade into the crowd and get between them. The deputy, a young man with a star pinned to a vest that looked borrowed, held up his hands. "All right, that is enough. You two can cool off in separate directions before someone gets hurt." The miner spat blood and stalked away, still grumbling. The cowboy stood there for a moment, his hand finally dropping away from his gun, then turned to look at Willa with an expression of pure confusion. She should have left then, should have climbed on her horse and ridden home before he could ask questions. But something made her wait, and he walked over, moving with the slightly bow-legged gait of a man who spent more time in the saddle than on foot. "I am obliged for the interruption," he said, his voice rough like sand and honey. "But I have never worked for the Parker Ranch, and my name is not Iris York." Willa felt her face heat. "I know. I just said the first thing that came to mind. You looked like you needed an exit from that situation." He studied her for a long moment, and she got her first good look at him. He was probably 26 or 27, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. A scar traced a thin line along his jaw, and his hands were calloused and scarred from hard work. "That was either real smart or real foolish," he said finally. "I have not decided which." "Probably both," Willa admitted. "The name actually is Iris," he said, and she detected the faintest hint of amusement in his tone. "Iris York, so you were not as far off as you thought." Now she really did feel her face burn. "Oh, well, that was lucky. Or you are better at reading brands than you let on. I worked the York family ranch in Montana until last year." He gestured to her loaded horse. "You live around here, north of town, Jameson Homestead. Tom Jameson's place." "Heard he died. He was my father." Something shifted in his expression, a softness that had not been there before. "I am sorry. He was good people. Sold me a jar once when I was passing through 2 years back. Best I ever had." Willa made a decision. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out one of the remaining jars, holding it out to him. "Consider it payment for letting me practice my lying." Iris York took the jar, turning it in the pale winter sunlight. "This your work?" "It is now." He met her eyes again, and there was something in that look, a recognition or curiosity that made her heart beat faster. "How much?" "No charge. I said it was payment. I do not take charity." "It is not charity, it is trade. You gave me an interesting story, I gave you whiskey. We are even." His mouth quirked, almost a smile. "That still feels like I am getting the better end of the deal." He tucked the jar carefully into his coat. "I am staying at the boarding house on 3rd Street. If you are ever back in town and feel like talking, I will buy you coffee. Least I can do." Willa found herself nodding before she really thought about it. "Maybe I will." She rode home as the afternoon sun turned the snow-covered hills to rose and gold, and she could not stop thinking about the way he had looked at her, like she was someone worth looking at. It was a dangerous thought for a woman alone. She needed to focus on survival, on making enough moonshine to last the winter and proving up the homestead. She did not have time for tall cowboys with scarred hands and eyes like creek water. But that night, as she started another batch of mash, she caught herself smiling. 3 weeks passed before she returned to boys. The weather had turned bitter, with temperatures dropping below zero and snow falling in waves that buried the cabin to the windowsills. Willa spent her days tending the still and her nights huddled by the fire, reading the same 3 books her father had owned until she had them memorized. Loneliness was a constant companion, more present than any ghost. When a brief warming trend melted enough snow to make the roads passable, she loaded up 20 jars and made the ride into town. The bartender at the Silver Spur was happy to see her, happier still to take her inventory. "Got customers asking specifically for the Jameson girls' brew," he said, counting out bills. "You are making a name for yourself." She sold 3 more jars to a restaurant owner and 2 to a lawyer who claimed he only drank for medicinal purposes. By the time she finished her deliveries, it was late afternoon and the temperature was dropping fast. She should have started for home immediately, but her horse needed rest and water, and she found herself walking down 3rd Street, looking for a boarding house she had no real business visiting. She found it sandwiched between a dry goods store and a seamstress shop, a narrow 2-story building with paint peeling from the shutters. Willa stood outside for a full minute, arguing with herself, before she finally pushed through the door. The interior was warm and smelled like boiled cabbage and lamp oil. An older woman sat behind a desk, knitting something lumpy and gray. She looked up at Willa with sharp eyes. "Help you? I am looking for someone. Iris York. I was told he is staying here." The woman's expression turned knowing and faintly disapproving. "Room 7. Upstairs. But if you are planning anything improper, you can just turn around. I run a respectable establishment. I am just delivering something," Willa lied and climbed the stairs before the woman could object further. Room 7 was at the end of a narrow hallway. Willa knocked before she could lose her nerve. There was a long pause, then footsteps, and the door opened to reveal Iris York in shirt sleeves and suspenders, his hair damp like he had just washed. He blinked at her in surprise. "Miss Jameson." "You said I should come by if I was in town," Willa said, feeling suddenly foolish. "For coffee." His surprise transformed into something warmer. "I did say that. Give me a minute to make myself presentable." He grabbed his coat and hat, and they walked to a small restaurant 2 streets over, a place with checkered tablecloths and steam fogging the windows. They ordered coffee and sat in a corner booth, and for a while, neither of them spoke, both nursing their cups and stealing glances. "Your moonshine was excellent," Iris said finally. "Best I have had, and I have had plenty." "Thank you. That means a lot, actually. I was not sure I could replicate my father's work." "You worried about making it through the winter." The question was direct, and Willa appreciated that. She was tired of people dancing around her situation. "I was, but the moonshine is selling. If I can keep producing and the weather does not get too bad, I should be fine." "That is a lot of ifs." "It is the only plan I have." He nodded slowly, turning his cup in his hands. His fingers were long, scarred across the knuckles. "I know about living on ifs. Spent the last 6 months drifting, picking up work where I can find it. Cowboying mostly, but also some carpentry, some logging. Whatever pays." "Why did you leave Montana?" Something shadowed his expression. "My father died. The ranch went to my older brother. He made it clear I was not needed." He said it without self-pity, just stating fact, but Willa heard the hurt underneath. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it. "Seems like we have that in common, dead fathers and uncertain futures." He met her eyes. "Though you at least have land, that counts for something." "It counts for a lot of work and worry," Willa said, but she smiled a little. They talked for an hour, the conversation flowing easier than she expected. He told her about Montana, about winters so cold the cattle froze standing up and summers when the grass went brown and the water holes dried to mud. She told him about Baltimore, about her mother's death and the journey west, about learning to make moonshine in the root cellar while her father kept watch for revenue agents. When they finally left the restaurant, it was full dark and snowing again, fat flakes drifting down through the lamplight. Iris walked her to her horse, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. "This was nice," he said, and there was something tentative in his voice, like he was testing the weight of the words. "I would like to do it again, if you are willing." Willa's heart did a complicated thing in her chest. "I come to town every 2 or 3 weeks, to sell. Then I will look for you." He paused, then added, "Be careful riding home. It is a long way in the dark." "I have made that ride 100 times, I know, but humor me. Worry is cheaper than flowers." She laughed at that, surprised and charmed. "I will be careful, and Iris, thank you for the coffee and the conversation." "The pleasure was entirely mine, Miss Jameson." "Willa," she said. "Call me Willa." "Willa," he repeated, and the way he said her name made it sound like something precious. She rode home through falling snow with warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. January arrived with a vengeance, bringing storms that lasted for days and cold that made the nails in the cabin walls frost over on the inside. Willa kept the fire burning day and night, feeding it logs from the dwindling woodpile, and ran the still as often as she dared. The work kept her warm and occupied, but the isolation was beginning to wear on her. Days would pass when she did not speak aloud except to her horse, and she found herself having conversations with her father's ghost, arguing with him about mash temperatures and fermentation times. She made it into Boys twice in January, both times staying just long enough to deliver her jars and snatch a few hours with Iris. They fell into a pattern, meeting at the restaurant for coffee that stretched into meals, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about a grizzly he had encountered in Montana, about a cattle drive that went wrong when the herd stampeded into a river. She told him about her mother's herb garden, about the time she had accidentally set the still on fire, and her father had laughed until he cried. There was an ease between them that Willa had never experienced before, a sense that she could say anything and be understood. But there was also tension, the awareness of attraction that neither of them quite acknowledged. Iris never touched her beyond a hand at her elbow when they crossed an icy street, never said anything improper, but Willa felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. On her second trip that month, as she was preparing to leave, he asked, "How are you fixed for firewood?" "Well enough," she lied. In truth, she was burning through her supply faster than anticipated, and the storms made it nearly impossible to cut more. He gave her a look that said he did not believe her. "I am between jobs right now. I could ride out to your place, help you cut and stack. Would not take more than a few days." Willa's first instinct was to refuse. Letting him see the homestead, see how she was really living, felt too vulnerable. But the practical part of her brain, the part that was very aware of the half-empty woodshed, overruled her pride. "I cannot pay much," she warned. "I am not asking for money. I am asking if you need help." "Why?" The question came out more blunt than she intended. "Why do you care?" He was quiet for a long moment, his expression serious. "Because I know what it is like to be alone and struggling and too proud to ask. And because I like you, Willa. I like talking to you. I would like to help if you will let me." The honesty in his voice undid something in her chest. "All right," she said softly. "Yes, I need help. And I would appreciate it." He arrived 3 days later on a sturdy roan gelding, his saddle packed with supplies. Willa watched from the cabin window as he rode up, her stomach a tangle of nerves and anticipation. She had spent the previous evening cleaning obsessively, as if he would judge her by the state of her floors, and had changed her dress twice, before settling on the simple wool-work dress she wore every day anyway. "This is a good spot," Iris said after she had shown him around the property. They were standing on the small rise behind the cabin, looking out over the valley. "Your father chose well. He always said the land would provide if we took care of it." Willa wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. "I am trying to prove him right." They spent that day and the next cutting wood, working in companionable silence broken by occasional conversation. Iris was strong and efficient, and Willa found herself watching the way he moved, the flex of his shoulders as he swung the axe. He caught her staring once and grinned, and she had turned away quickly, face burning. In the evenings they ate together, simple meals of beans and cornbread that Willa cooked on the iron stove. The cabin felt different with him in it, less like a mausoleum and more like a home. They talked late into the night, sitting by the fire, and Willa found herself sharing things she had never told anyone. About her fear of failing, of losing the homestead, of ending up destitute and alone. About the guilt she felt for being relieved sometimes that her father was gone, because his illness had been so hard to watch. "That is not something to feel guilty about," Iris said quietly. "It is human. We want the people we love to stop suffering, even when it means losing them." "Did you feel that way about your father?" "No. He died in a barn fire trying to save the horses. It was fast." He stared into the flames. "I wish I had felt guilt. Mostly I just felt angry, at him for dying, at my brother for being glad about it, at myself for leaving." "You left after." "I left during the funeral." His jaw tightened. My brother gave a speech about how it was all part of God's plan, how the ranch would thrive under his leadership. I realized he had been waiting for this and I could not stomach it, so I walked out of the church, saddled my horse and rode south. Willa reached out and touched his hand, a brief pressure of her fingers against his. I am glad you did. Otherwise, you would not be here. He turned his hand to catch hers, his grip warm and solid. I am glad too. They stayed like that for a heartbeat too, and then Iris released her hand and stood. I should let you sleep. It is late. He had been staying in the small shed her father had used for storage, insisting he did not want to impose by sleeping inside. Willa wanted to tell him it was no imposition, wanted to ask him to stay by the fire, but propriety and her own uncertainty held her tongue. On the third day, a storm rolled in, and it became clear that Iris would not be leaving any time soon. The snow fell so thick they could barely see the shed from the cabin, and the wind howled like something alive. Willa insisted he bring his bedroll inside, and they spent the day taking turns tending the fire and the still, reading aloud from her father's books and talking. "Read me something else," Iris said that evening. They were sitting close to conserve warmth, shoulders almost touching. Willa picked up the book of poetry her mother had loved, opening to a random page. She read about love and loss, about the passage of seasons and the constancy of the earth, and when she looked up, Iris was watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "You have a beautiful voice," he said quietly. "It is just reading. No, it is more than that." He hesitated, then said, "Willa, I need to tell you something." Her heart began to pound. "What?" "I was not exactly honest about why I came here. I mean, you do need the firewood, but that is not the only reason." He took a breath. "I have been thinking about you since the day we met. When I go to sleep, I am thinking about you. When I wake up, you are the first thing on my mind. And I know this is complicated and maybe inappropriate, but I had to tell you, I care about you, more than I have cared about anyone in a long time." Willa stared at him, her thoughts a jumble. Part of her wanted to be cautious, to protect herself from the risk of heartbreak. But a larger part, the part that had been lonely for so long, wanted to lean into this, to take the chance. "I care about you too," she said, and it felt like stepping off a cliff. "I did not want to. It seemed like a terrible idea given everything, but I do." "Is it a terrible idea?" His voice was rough, hopeful. "Probably," she smiled. "But I have been making terrible decisions all winter. One more will not hurt." He laughed, relief and joy mixed together, and then he was reaching for her, his hand cupping her face with a gentleness that made her want to cry. "Can I kiss you?" "Yes," she whispered, and then his mouth was on hers, warm and sure and perfect. The kiss started soft, exploratory, but deepened quickly as weeks of restrained wanting spilled over. Willa's hands found his shoulders, his hair, pulling him closer. Iris made a low sound in his throat and wrapped his arms around her waist, and for a while there was nothing but the heat between them and the storm raging outside. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Iris rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for so long." "Then why did you wait?" "I did not want to presume. You have enough to deal with without me complicating things." Willa laughed shakily. "Everything is already complicated. You just made it better." They kissed again, slower this time, savoring it. Eventually they settled back by the fire, Willa tucked against Iris's side, his arm around her shoulders. It felt right in a way that scared and thrilled her in equal measure. "What do we do now?" she asked after a while. "I do not know," he admitted, "but I know I do not want to leave." "Not unless you want me to." "I do not want you to." She tilted her head to look up at him. "Stay, not just until the storm passes. Stay for the season. Help me run the homestead. There is plenty of work, and I can feed you and I can pay you in moonshine if nothing else." He smiled, that slow, warm smile that made her stomach flip. "You had me at stay." The storm lasted 2 more days, and by the time it cleared, something fundamental had shifted between them. Iris moved his things into the cabin, setting up his bedroll on the far side of the room to maintain some appearance of propriety, though they both knew it was mostly for show. They worked side by side during the days, cutting wood, tending the still, and maintaining the property. In the evenings they cooked together, read together, talked together, and stole kisses by the fire. Willa had never been happier. The loneliness that had been crushing her lifted, replaced by a sense of partnership and possibility. Iris had a knack for fixing things, and he spent a week repairing all the small problems around the homestead that she had been ignoring. A cracked window, a loose door hinge, a section of fence that had collapsed under snow. He was patient and methodical, and he never made her feel incapable, even when he was doing something she could not. In return, she taught him the art of distilling, walking him through every step from mash to bottling. He was a quick study, asking intelligent questions and remembering details. "You are a better teacher than you think," he told her one afternoon as they filtered a batch through cheesecloth. "Or you are a better student than I think," she countered. "Maybe we are both just good together." It was a simple statement, but it carried weight. They were good together. The easy compatibility they had found over coffee in town had only deepened with proximity. They balanced each other, her caution tempering his impulsiveness, his optimism lifting her worry. They argued sometimes, usually about small things like whether to sell in Boys or try to reach the mining camps to the north. But even their arguments felt productive rather than destructive. February brought a brief thaw, and they took advantage of it to make a trip into town together. Willa sold 30 jars and bought supplies while Iris restocked his own gear. They ate lunch at the restaurant, sitting across from each other in the booth they had come to think of as theirs, and Willa could feel eyes on them. People were noticing that the Jameson girl had a man living with her, and tongues would wag. "Does it bother you?" Iris asked, following her gaze. "The talk?" "It should," Willa said. "By all rights, I should care desperately about my reputation, but I find I do not. Or at least I care about you more. We could make it official," he said carefully. "If you wanted. I know a preacher." Willa's heart jumped, but she forced herself to think practically. "Is that what you want, or are you just trying to protect my reputation?" "I want you," he said, low and intense. "Any way I can have you. If that is living in sin on your homestead, I am content. If you want a ring and vows, I will get on my knees right now. I am not proposing out of obligation, Willa. I am proposing because I love you." The world seemed to tilt. "You love me?" "Of course I love you. How could I not?" He reached across the table and took her hand. "You are the bravest, most stubborn, most fascinating woman I have ever met. You make illegal whiskey and read poetry and somehow manage to make me feel like I am exactly where I am supposed to be. So yes, I love you, and if it is too soon to say that or if you do not feel the same way, I understand, but I needed you to know." Tears pricked Willa's eyes. "It is not too soon, and I do feel the same way. I love you, Iris York. I think I have loved you since the day you almost got stabbed over a card game." He laughed, relieved and joyous, and squeezed her hand. "So, is that a yes? Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, and suddenly she was laughing too, giddy with it. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married a week later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Boys, with the preacher's wife and a curious rancher as witnesses. Willa wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, and Iris wore his best shirt and a vest he borrowed from the boarding house landlady. They spoke their vows in voices that shook with emotion, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Iris kissed her like it was the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. They spent their wedding night in a room at the boarding house, the luxury of privacy and a real bed and extravagance after months of sleeping near the fire. Iris was gentle and reverent, treating her like something precious, and Willa felt a completeness she had not known she was missing. Afterward, they lay tangled together, talking in whispers while snow fell outside the window. "I cannot believe you are my wife," Iris murmured, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. "I cannot believe you are my husband," Willa replied. "A month ago I was alone and terrified. Now I have you. Now we have each other." He kissed her forehead. "We are going to make this work, Willa. The homestead, the moonshine, all of it. We are going to build a life." "I believe you," she said, and realized she meant it. They returned to the homestead the next day, and life took on a new rhythm. They worked as a team in every sense, their partnership extending into all aspects of life. Iris proved to be as skilled at distilling as he had claimed, and together they increased production, experimenting with different grains and aging techniques. One batch, aged in a charred oak barrel Iris had traded for in town, turned out so smooth and rich that Willa knew they could charge double for it. "We should call it something," Iris suggested as they sampled it one evening. "Give it a name, set it apart." "Like what?" He thought for a moment, then said, "Jameson York Reserve. We are partners now, might as well make it official." Willa felt warmth spread through her chest. "I like that, though technically I am a York now too." "True. But Jameson is the name people know, the name your father built. We should honor that." They bottled 6 jars of the reserve and took them to Boy's the following week. The bartender at the Silver Spur tried it and immediately ordered 12 more jars at $3 each. Word spread quickly, and soon Willa and Iris were getting requests from as far away as Idaho City and Silver City. The money started to accumulate, enough that they could think beyond just survival. "We should expand," Iris said one night in March, as they reviewed their finances by lamplight. "Buy another still, maybe hire some help for the heavy work. We could double our output." "That is a big risk," Willa said, though the idea excited her. "What if the revenue agents crack down? What if demand drops? What if it does not?" He looked at her seriously. "We have something special here, Willa. Something worth investing in. And yes, there is risk. But when has that ever stopped you?" She thought about it for several days, weighing the possibilities. In the end, pragmatism won out over caution. They bought a second, smaller still from a prospector who was retiring, and hired a young man named Charlie from town to help with the heavy lifting and deliveries. Charlie was 19, good-natured, and incurious about the legality of his employment. He worked hard, kept his mouth shut, and became an invaluable part of their operation. As winter gave way to spring, the homestead transformed. The snow melted in rushing streams, revealing the brown earth beneath. Willa and Iris planted a garden, expanding her father's old vegetable patch to include potatoes, squash, and beans. They repaired the chicken coop and bought 6 laying hens, adding fresh eggs to their diet. Iris built a proper smokehouse, and they began curing meat to sell alongside the moonshine. Life was full and busy and good. They fell into bed exhausted every night and woke before dawn to start again. But it did not feel like hardship. It felt like building something, like taking the broken pieces of their separate lives and forging them into something whole. In April, Willa realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a week or two, but confirmation came when she could not keep down her breakfast 3 mornings in a row. She told Iris that evening, watching his face carefully for his reaction. His eyes went wide, then he broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen. "Really? Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor. but all the signs are there. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing, then set her down hastily. Sorry, should I not have done that? Is that bad for the baby? Iris, I am fine. The baby is fine. Pregnant women are not made of glass. But she was laughing too, caught up in his joy. We are going to be parents, he said, wonder in his voice. You are going to be a mother, and you are going to be a father. She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. Our baby. They stood like that for a long moment, the magnitude of it settling over them. It was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. Another mouth to feed, another responsibility, but also a future. Proof that they were more than just surviving. The pregnancy was easier than Willa had feared. She was tired and queasy for the first few months, but by summer she felt strong and energetic, her body adapting to the changes. Iris fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more and work less, until she finally had to sit him down and explain that she was pregnant, not dying, and she needed to feel useful. I just want you to be safe, he said, frustrated. You and the baby. We are safe, she assured him. And we will stay that way as long as you stop treating me like I am fragile. I need to work, Iris. I need to be part of this. He relented, though he still watched her like a hawk anytime she lifted something heavier than a jar. Willa found it equal parts annoying and endearing. They continued to expand the business through the summer and fall. The Jameson York name became synonymous with quality, and they started getting orders from as far as Boise City and even Lewiston. They hired 2 more workers, both trustworthy men recommended by Charlie, and converted the shed into a proper distillery. Iris built a hidden cellar beneath the new structure, accessible only through a trapdoor where they could hide inventory if the law came calling. The law never did. They were careful, discreet, and generous with their product. The local sheriff received a jar every month, as did the mayor and several influential businessmen. It was the cost of doing business, and it bought them a measure of protection. By October, Willa was heavily pregnant, her belly round and the baby active. She spent more time in the cabin, focusing on the administrative side of the business while Iris and the workers handled production. She kept the books, managed orders, and planned for the future. They were making real money now, enough to think about buying more land, maybe even building a larger house. The baby came on a cold November night, almost exactly a year after Willa had started her first batch of moonshine. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Willa genuinely thought she might die. But Iris stayed with her the whole time, holding her hand and speaking soft encouragements, and when the midwife finally placed a squalling infant in her arms, Willa forgot all about the pain. A boy, the midwife announced, smiling, strong and healthy. Willa looked down at her son, his red face and tiny fists, and felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. Iris leaned over her shoulder, his own eyes wet with tears, and touched the baby's cheek with one gentle finger. He is perfect, he whispered. He is ours, Willa said, and kissed her husband's temple. They named him Thomas after her father, with the middle name Elias after Iris's grandfather. Thomas Elias York, the boy who would inherit their kingdom of moonshine and ambition. The first months of parenthood were exhausting. Thomas was a colicky baby who slept poorly and cried often, and Willa spent most nights walking the cabin with him while Iris tried to catch enough sleep to work the next day. But even in her exhaustion, Willa felt a deep contentment. This was what she had been fighting for all along. Not just survival, but a life. A family. As Thomas grew, the business continued to thrive. They now employed 6 people full-time, and the Jameson York Reserve was sold in saloons and hotels throughout southern Idaho. They paid taxes on their legitimate enterprises, the garden and the chickens and the cured meat, and everyone politely ignored where the real money came from. In the spring, when Thomas was 6 months old, Iris came home one day with a proposition. I talked to the Wilson brothers. They are selling their land, the plot that borders ours to the east. 80 acres, good grazing land, a creek running through it. They want $800. Willa did the math in her head. They had the money, barely. It would wipe out most of their savings, but it would also double their landholding. What would we do with it? Run cattle or sheep? Something legitimate to explain our income. He sat down across from her, Thomas gurgling happily on his lap. I know we have a good thing going with the Moonshine, but it is always going to be risky. If we can diversify, build something legal and sustainable, we will be safer. And it would be something to pass on to Thomas, something he can be proud of. It made sense. Willa had been thinking along similar lines, worrying about what would happen if prohibition came to Idaho territory, or if they finally ran afoul of the law. Having a legitimate operation would provide cover and security. Let's do it, she said. They bought the land and spent the summer fencing it and building a small barn. Iris rode to Oregon and returned with 30 head of cattle, good stock that he had bargained down to a reasonable price. They hired a couple of cowhands to help manage the herd, and suddenly they were ranchers as well as bootleggers. The work was relentless, but Willa loved it. She loved watching the cattle graze in the long grass, loved the way Thomas squealed with delight when Iris put him on a horse, loved the sense that they were building something that would last beyond them. Not everything was easy. There were hard seasons when the cattle got sick or the weather turned against them. There were close calls with the law, though their bribes always held. There was the time a rival operation tried to move into their territory, and Iris had to have a very pointed conversation that involved veiled threats and a visible sidearm. But through it all, they had each other. On the worst days, when Willa was exhausted and worried and ready to quit, Iris would wrap his arms around her and remind her how far they had come. On the days when Iris was frustrated and doubting himself, Willa would pull him back to center, reminding him of his strength and capability. They built a new house when Thomas was 2, a proper ranch house with 4 bedrooms and a parlor and a kitchen big enough to cook for a crew. Willa hung her mother's wedding portrait in the front hall and her father's rifle over the fireplace. It was a declaration, a statement that they belonged here and intended to stay. Thomas grew into a bright, curious boy with his mother's stubbornness and his father's easy charm. He learned to ride before he could write and could identify grain mash by smell before he started school. Willa and Iris decided early on that they would be honest with him about the family business, but they also made sure he understood the risks and the need for discretion. When Thomas was 5, Willa discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and the birth, while still difficult, was faster. They welcomed a daughter, Marion, in the spring of 1890. She had dark hair like her father and green eyes like her mother, and Thomas was immediately smitten with his baby sister. Life settled into a comfortable pattern. The Moonshine business remained profitable but discreet, the ranch grew, and the family thrived. They were respected in the community, known for their generosity and hard work. People knew what they did, or at least suspected, but no one talked about it openly. It was the kind of arrangement that worked as long as everyone played their part. In 1892, when Thomas was 7 and Marion was 2, the federal government began cracking down on illegal distilling operations throughout the territories. Revenue agents appeared in buoys, asking questions and making arrests. Willa and Iris made the difficult decision to shut down the stills temporarily. hiding the equipment in the underground cellar and focusing entirely on the ranch. It was a lean year financially, but they made it through. The cattle brought in enough money to cover expenses, and they had savings to fall back on. More importantly, they avoided arrest. Several of their competitors were not so lucky, and Willa counted their blessings every day. When the heat died down, they considered restarting the Moonshine operation but ultimately decided against it. The ranch was doing well, and the risk no longer seemed worth the reward. They sold their recipes and remaining inventory to a trusted associate in exchange for a percentage of his profits, a passive income that supplemented their legitimate earnings. It was strange, at first, not having the stills bubbling in the background, but it was also freeing. They could focus entirely on the ranch and the children, on building a legacy that would not land anyone in prison. The years passed in the way that years do when life is good. Thomas grew tall and serious, with a gift for working with animals. Marion was wild and fearless, always covered in dirt and climbing trees her mother insisted were too high. They added sheep to the cattle, expanded the garden, and built a second barn. Iris and Willa grew older together, their love deepening in the way that comes from shared struggle and triumph. They still stole kisses in the barn and held hands under the dinner table, still talked late into the night about dreams and plans. They argued, of course, about money and child rearing and whose turn it was to deal with the broken fence, but they always circled back to each other. When Thomas turned 16, Iris gave him a choice. He could stay on the ranch and learn the business, or he could go east to school and make his own path. Thomas chose the ranch without hesitation, and Iris spent the next 2 years teaching him everything he knew about cattle, land management, and negotiation. Willa taught him the financial side, how to keep books and manage credit and plan for lean seasons. Marion, on the other hand, announced at 13 that she intended to be a doctor. It was an audacious goal for a girl from rural Idaho, but Willa and Iris never considered discouraging her. They had built their life on audacious goals. They began saving for her education, setting aside money for the day she would leave for medical school. In 1900, when Iris was 43 and Willa was 40, they took a rare trip to Boise to celebrate their 10th wedding anniversary. They stayed at the best hotel, ate at the fanciest restaurant, and danced in a ballroom for the first time in their lives. It was extravagant and wonderful, and lying in bed afterward, Willa realized that she could not imagine her life any other way. "You ever regret it?" she asked Iris in the darkness. "The way we started, the risks we took." "Not for a second," he said immediately. "Every choice led me to you, to this. How could I regret that? I feel the same way, even the hard parts, especially the hard parts maybe." She turned to face him, barely visible in the dim light from the window. "I love you, Iris York, more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone." "I love you too," he said and kissed her forehead. "Here is to the next 10 years, and the 10 after that. And all the years beyond that we are lucky enough to get." They returned to the ranch renewed and recommitted, throwing themselves into the work with fresh energy. The ranch continued to prosper, becoming one of the most successful operations in the region. They won awards at the county fair for their cattle and their sheep, and Willa's preserves became locally famous. Thomas married at 22, a sweet-natured girl named Anna who grew up on a neighboring ranch. They built a small house on the property, and Anna threw herself into ranch life with enthusiasm. Willa taught her to can and garden, and Anna taught Willa new recipes her own grandmother had brought from Germany. The two women became fast friends, and Willa felt blessed to have a daughter-in-law she genuinely liked. Marion left for medical school in Chicago in 1903, and the house felt emptier without her chaos. But she wrote long, detailed letters about her studies and the city, and came home every summer to work on the ranch and regale them with stories. She graduated in 1907, one of only 3 women in her class, and opened a practice in Boise. She never married, declaring that medicine was husband enough, and Willa was fiercely proud of her. Grandchildren arrived in due course. Thomas and Anna had 4 children in 6 years, 2 boys and 2 girls, and the ranch house echoed with their laughter and arguing. Willa had worried she would be the type of grandmother to hover and interfere, but she found she was content to let Thomas and Anna do the parenting while she baked cookies and told stories. Iris took to grandfatherhood like he was born for it. He built toys, taught the children to ride, and could always be counted on for an adventure or a tall tale. Watching him with the grandchildren, Willa fell in love with him all over again. As they moved into their 50s and 60s, their hair turning gray and their bodies slowing down, Iris and Willa began to step back from the day-to-day operation of the ranch. Thomas was more than capable of running things, and they trusted him completely. They spent their days working in the garden, reading, and taking long rides across the property. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch they had built onto the front of the house, watching the sun set over the mountains. Sometimes they talked, reminiscing about the early days or speculating about the future. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, content in each other's presence. "You remember that first winter?" Willa asked one evening when they were both 70. "When I was alone and terrified and making moonshine just to survive." "I remember a woman brave enough to do whatever it took," Iris said. "I remember thinking I had never met anyone like you." "I remember a cowboy who bought a jar and decided to stay," Willa said softly. "Best decision you ever made." "Best decision we ever made," he corrected and leaned over to kiss her. They had 42 years together in total, years filled with work and love and the ordinary magic of a life well lived. When Iris died in his sleep at 75, Willa grieved deeply but without bitterness. They had been given more time than most people got, more happiness than they had any right to expect. She lived another 8 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She told them stories about their grandfather, about the moonshine and the early struggles, about building something from nothing. She made sure they understood that love was the foundation of everything, that without it, all the land and cattle and money meant nothing. Willa died on a crisp October morning in 1928, 70 years old and content. Thomas found her in the garden, sitting peacefully in her chair with a book open in her lap, gone as gently as a person could go. They buried her next to Iris on the hill overlooking the valley, and the entire county turned out for her funeral. The ranch continued, passed down through generations. The Jameson York name became synonymous with quality and integrity, though few people remembered the moonshine origins by the time the 20th century was half over. But the family remembered. They told the story to their children and grandchildren, the tale of a woman who brewed moonshine to survive her first winter alone, and a cowboy who bought a jar and stayed for the season. And in staying, they built an empire of love that outlasted them both, a legacy not of whiskey or cattle or land, but of 2 people who found each other in the hardest of times and decided that together they could survive anything. That was the true inheritance, the real treasure they left behind. Not wealth or property, but proof that love, when tended with care and commitment, could transform everything. The moonshine had saved Willa that first winter, given her a way to survive when all seemed lost. But Iris had saved her in a different way, showing her that survival was not enough, that she deserved more than just getting through each day. She deserved joy and partnership and a future worth building, and together they had built something extraordinary. A home, a family, a love story for the ages, written in the wild west hills of Idaho, begun with copper stills and corn mash, and the desperate courage of a woman alone, transformed by the steady devotion of a cowboy who saw her worth and chose to stay. Their great-great-grandchildren still work the land, still tell the stories, still honor the legacy. And on quiet evenings when the wind is right, you can almost smell the ghost of moonshine on the air, sweet and sharp and full of promise, a reminder of where it all began. The Jameson York Ranch stands as a testament to what can be built when two people refuse to quit on each other or themselves. The main house, renovated and expanded over the decades, but still recognizably the structure Iris built, sits solid and welcoming. The barn that once hid illegal stills now shelters horses and equipment. The land that was nearly lost to winter and isolation now supports hundreds of head of cattle and a thriving agricultural operation. But more than the physical legacy, more than the land and buildings and bloodlines, what endures is the story. The story of Willa Jameson, who faced down winter with nothing but determination and a copper still. The story of Iris York, who recognized something precious and decided it was worth fighting for. The story of a love that began with a jar of moonshine and grew into something that shaped generations. It is a story told around dinner tables and campfires, embellished over the years but always true in the ways that matter. A story about courage and choosing each other, about building something from nothing, about the ways that love can transform desperation into hope and survival into thriving. And at the heart of it all, always, is that first jar of moonshine and the cowboy who bought it. That single transaction, that moment of connection in the midst of struggle, became the foundation of everything that followed. A reminder that we never know which small moments will change our lives, which ordinary days will become the beginning of something extraordinary. Willa and Iris's story became part of the fabric of Idaho history, part of the mythology of the West. Museums in Boise feature exhibits about the early bootleggers, and the Jameson York operation is always mentioned with a mixture of admiration and amusement. Historians debate the details, but the descendants know the truth, passed down through careful oral tradition. They know about the first winter, when Willa nearly froze and starved but refused to quit. They know about Iris arriving to help with firewood and deciding to stay. They know about the moonshine years, the close calls with the law, the decision to go legitimate. They know about the children and grandchildren, about the slow, steady building of something that would last. And they know about the love. The deep, abiding, world-changing love that made all of it possible. Because that is the secret that Willa and Iris understood and lived by. That the best things in life are built by two people working together, supporting each other through the hard times and celebrating each other in the good times, choosing each other over and over again, day after day, year after year, until their individual lives become one shared story. The moonshine was survival. The ranch was security. But the love was everything. It was the reason to survive, the foundation for security, the purpose behind all the work and struggle. It was what transformed a hardscrabble homestead into a home, what turned two wounded, lonely people into partners and then into legends. Thomas and Marion grew old themselves, passing the torch to the next generation. The great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren continued the work, keeping the ranch thriving, keeping the stories alive. They faced their own challenges, their own hard seasons, but they had the example of Willa and Iris to guide them. When times got tough, they remembered the Moonshine winter and the cowboy who stayed, and they found the courage to keep going. The copper still itself, the one that started it all, sits in a place of honor in the ranch house, polished and gleaming. It has not been used in over a century, but it remains, a relic and a reminder. Sometimes the grandchildren touch it reverently, connecting themselves to their history, to the woman who risked everything and the man who loved her enough to stay. And on the hill overlooking the valley, two headstones stand side by side, weathered now by decades of sun and wind and snow. The inscriptions are simple, just names and dates, but everyone who visits knows the real story. They know that these two people, buried together in the earth they fought to keep, loved each other with a fierceness that changed everything. The legacy of Willa Jameson and Iris York is not measured in acres or dollars, though there are plenty of both. It is measured in the lives they touched, the family they created, the love they proved possible. It is measured in the fact that more than a century after that first winter, their names are still spoken with respect and affection, their story still told, their love still remembered. Because in the end, that is what we all hope for. Not wealth or fame, but to be remembered for loving well and being loved in return. To leave behind evidence that we were here, that we mattered, that we made a difference in the lives of those we cared about. Willa and Iris did that. They took their broken pieces and built something beautiful. They took their separate loneliness and created a family. They took a desperate winter and turned it into a love story for the ages. And in doing so, they proved that the best things in life often come from the hardest circumstances, that hope can be found in unlikely places, and that sometimes the person who saves us is the one who needs saving just as much. The moonshine was just the beginning. The real magic was what came after, the staying, the choosing, the building of a life together day by day, season by season, year by year. That was the miracle. That was the legacy. That was the story worth telling and retelling, worth preserving and honoring, worth aspiring to in our own lives. And so the story endures, passed down and treasured, a reminder that love is the greatest adventure, the most worthwhile risk, the one thing that makes survival worthwhile and transforms mere existence into a life fully lived. Willa brewed moonshine to survive her first winter alone, and Iris bought a jar and stayed for the season. But what they built together lasted far beyond a single season, far beyond their own lifetimes, echoing down through the generations as proof that love, when given freely and tended carefully, can change the world.